Welcome to the Glucose Neverlies podcast. I'm John Pemberton, a diabetes educator and researcher living with type 1 diabetes since 2008. I started the Glucose Neverlies website when my son tested positive for type 1 diabetes antibodies. In that moment, I realised I needed to build a resource strong enough to guide anyone who might care for him, and something I wish I'd had when I was first diagnosed. At first, that meant writing clear, actionable management guides, but listening to Peter Attia's The Drive taught me something. The written word often misses important details and context. Peter's conversations provide depth across nutrition, exercise, pharmacology, sleep, and much more. But I always find myself wondering, how does this information apply to people with type 1 diabetes? And this podcast is my attempt to fill that gap. Through my work as a specialist diabetes dietitian, I develop international guidelines, serve on global committees, publish in peer-reviewed journals, and present at international conferences. Therefore, I have access to the world's leading researchers and thought leaders in type 1 diabetes. That gives me a unique opportunity to combine lived experience, professional expertise, and cutting-edge science, and to share it all on here in conversation. That's why on this show you'll find the latest scientific evidence translated into practical steps, honest conversations on getting the most out of diabetes technology, insights on balancing nutrition, exercise, and sleep while living a full life, lived experiences on how to party, play sports, and much more, all in the context of type 1 diabetes. But an important note, this podcast is for informational purposes only. These conversations share knowledge and experiences. They do not create a therapeutic relationship. So, let's get started. First of all, thank you for taking the time out. I know EASD is extremely busy and you've had like 85 million meetings today and got another, obviously, lots of other engagements. So first of all, I appreciate your time.
No, John, I think thank you very much for the invite. You're doing some great work on this podcast, which I keep listening to, some great educational stuff. So first of all, thanks for the invite. And secondly, hopefully I can contribute something to it, the whole thing.
I mean, I would give a long introduction, but everyone kind of knows you and what you've done. But essentially, I would like to give my introduction of what I think of when I think of your work within, I guess, the diabetes sphere. Obviously starts with for me anyway, it starts with the CGM, the implementation, more than anything else. Because I think one thing I saw you actually tweet about and it really made me think is science is great, but the science of implementation is where the rubber meets the road. And I think there's probably nobody better than you in the diabetes sphere that has actually managed to achieve that for the UK perspective. And I think there's people who are watching this will probably know that, but I'd like to dig into what it takes to take it from the science to the street, essentially. So that's kind of the flavor I think people would like to hear a little bit more, but also there's a lot of healthcare professionals from the UK, from further afield, who can get some ideas of how do you get this stuff to people with type 1. Tell me about the CGM journey. How did you get involved in it? How did it kick off? Where did you come in and think, right, for this to work, this is going to need to happen, and how am I going to do it?
Yeah, I mean, I think the first primary thing is I took the job, or I was offered the job with a very simple remit, type 1 diabetes outcomes are not great in this country. And that was 2016, actually, April. So next year, March, it will be a decade. I would say that probably for the first year or so, I mostly listened to the community a lot. I went to meetings online when things were probably not as toxic as it is nowadays. But I think people with type 1 diabetes are very open about what they would want and what they would like to have, but also appreciative of the pressures people are under. So one thing that struck out for me was the whole concept that it doesn't feel like we have much say in our diabetes care. So I started looking around about some science and everything, and I talking to colleagues as well, such as Emma Wilmot, Pratik Chaudhary, Ian Cranston. I think one thing that came out that obviously continuous glucose monitors had been around, but not really mainstream. So that made me think. And then at that time, Freestyle Libre had come into the United States in 2014. My question was, why do we not have it? I mean, what's going on? And it seemed like it was common that, oh yeah, some of the children get it, but that's about it. So that started me the journey of saying, well, first of all, I was amazed that we didn't even have it on formulary. I mean, I remember speaking to Abbott and they said, well, the UK, not sure about the penetration. So for me, the more I looked into it, it felt like you could give a bit more control of your life to you. And I've been a fundamental believer of the fact that it doesn't matter how many healthcare professionals you throw at this, you still will only see the person with type 1 diabetes or type 2 diabetes only for a super fraction of their life. So the more I can give you back. So that's where the journey started. And of course, a lot of checkered history of negotiations, money, evidence, talking to people, which sort of started the journey. But I think to your question, what started was I probably would credit a lot to the type 1 diabetes community for saying this is not what we have in our lives. And that probably was the starting block, I would say.
Yeah, well, that makes total sense. No one knows more what they need than people with the condition, but often struggle to kind of find that voice. And I'm guessing social media played a huge part of that, as you kind of mentioned there. And when did your kind of genesis of harnessing the power of social media to interact with the community that you would have never been able to? I mean, like, you take it back to like 1995, like, you just wouldn't be able to do it. That connection with them, was that obviously deliberate? Was that kind of like something that just happened organically?
Yeah, I probably would mention one gentleman at this time, or two actually, who were my inspiration as to why I did diabetes. And what I loved about, so they were never that big, if that makes sense, but to their patient, they were amazing. One was Dr. David Jenkins in Worcester, and the other was Dr. Tony Zarlin. And I've spoken about them before. What I loved about them is how they kept on telling me, you need to be a guide in the journey. You know, don't try and tell them. And they were amazing in their clinics. Most of the time, they didn't say a thing.
Listen.
And it was amazing, and they all loved them. And so what I learned from that is that somehow I need to reach out to all these people beyond my clinics. Social media, as I mentioned, was a different animal in those days, and it was very easy to sort of ask people a few things, and they would come back. They were very generous with their views, and I think that to me opened the doors. And why don't I use more of, so rather than posting pictures of my dog all the time, which I still do, why not a bit more? Why not talk about information cascade? Why not put the things out? So I think 2017, 18 onwards, you really started to understand the power of the community and how you, with your position of privilege, which I have as a consultant in diabetes, you can sort of say, no, I think they're saying the right thing. You know, what's wrong with what they're asking for? So I think that gives you a lot of power, and in a very double-edged sword way, what it does do, it also gives me, on a selfish perspective, a lot of clout when I go to meetings saying, but this is what people are saying. This is not just, my made-up thing. So I think social media has been a massive, massive part of the journey.
So how was that transition? Because I'm interested, because at the start of this podcast, I have very rarely dipped into social media, but now I'm obviously having to push out there. And for me, it's kind of a journey of, how do you approach it? What do you do? And that's part of the fun of learning, I guess. But I guess your situation where it's developing for you, and as you said quite rightly, it's a double-edged sword. Gives you the opportunity to really harness the voice, and also, but at the same time, you're getting pinged 85,000 times a day because everyone wants recognition. Because if you recognize something, then a lot of people get exposure to it. How do you manage that at the moment? Because that's, you must get pinged. I mean, I hate to think how many red notifications you've got on your thing.
Yeah, I think you do get it, and I tend to sort of go through them as much as feasible. I think some of them I'll answer, not all of them, but I think it's the trend that you pick up. And I think what social media is a very interesting animal, because we can talk about the negativity on social media, but I can tell you one thing. I rarely have ever had any negativity from the type 1 diabetes community, right? They have been appreciative. Okay, there have been some frustrated comments, and I get it, but there's never been anything personal, ever, right? People are incredibly kind and warm. And so I think if you niche it into the diabetes community, I think they're a very giving community, and social media is where they can express themselves. So I found that journey much easier compared to lots of other areas, which I'm sure we'll talk about. But type 1 diabetes, or diabetes per se, language matters, was a lovely piece of work. That was a very social media sort of concept that came through. And also learning that, language matters is a very good example where people say, look, it's not about whether I'm a diabetic or person with diabetes. I just want to be talked to like a human being. So I think those important lessons, and I would probably go so far as to say that I probably have learned more about diabetes care in my interaction with those with diabetes than anything I learned in my training years, right? Learn about the modulations of insulin, this, that. But I think what this has taught me is the ability of understanding the science a bit better, the lived experience. So that's where it's been wonderful for my own learning.
And certainly one thing that I think you've been the perfect exponent of that's helped every single diabetes centre is by creating accountability through social media, i.e. the heat maps with the uptake of CGM, which ICBs are doing it, which aren't. And I've sat in a number of ICB meetings, and as clinicians, they put on the map and go, in Birmingham, we're not doing anything. And then, but if you look at the rest of the country, can you explain to us why they have found the money or the pathway and why we're still here? That was never possible before, because you would go in and be like, you didn't have that sheep factor. They're down the road. They're literally in Worcester, and they're gone green. And we haven't started yet. And that was a massive for us, because I know in 2019, that allowed us to push for a policy. And from there, I was like, right, we've got the green light, boom. And within a year, we had everybody on.
Yeah.
But without that accountability being driven on a national level and that visibility, I don't think that would happen. I don't think that happened in a lot of places. Do you think that's fair?
I agree. I think I've got this philosophy about the journey that I've got about leadership. When you ask people or leaders for accountability, I think a lot of people start taking it personally. And it's not. We're not saying you're a good leader or a bad leader. We understand you've got pressures. But data needs to be transparent, because otherwise, how do the people with diabetes get a voice? How do the clinicians get a voice? Because data is so shrouded up. So it was not a question of saying you're good or you're bad, and it was interpreted in different ways. But I always say that there's very easy ways for you to not be pinged is get yourself into the green zone. That's all we're asking you to do. So accountability is important. And, everybody's reaping the benefits of it now with their HbA1c improvements and stuff. So it's about nudging people. I think for me, it was also a learning point. I tend to do it a bit differently nowadays, but I think accountability is important. Accountability is not blaming. Accountability is taking responsibility for your role. That's what it is.
And I think that's something that really just jumped out at me, something we do in our clinic. We have a HbA1c list of green, amber, red, and I am so potent on the discussion as soon as possible. This isn't bad, okay, good, it is. Red is stop. We need to do something different. And that is not, there's no valence attached to that. It's just stop when it's just the amber is, we're kind of, okay, let's just wait, maybe a couple of tweaks, green, go, no issue.
Yeah.
But other people, as soon as the interpret is like red and bad, it's just your interpretation. I think that language around the accountability piece is so important. I think that's something that's developed.
And I think you said a very interesting thing, because one of the things I always talk about when we do time in range, I always say I say to clinicians when I teach them, look, it's an insight into people's lives, and they've given you permission to see it. You need to use that responsibly. So if you are now saying, I got 30% time in range, what are you doing? No, the answer should be, listen, 30%, it's all right. This is what it is. Life is such. Let's try and get you to 40, right? And I've said this before on social media. So I always say this, 50%, it's good. We need to do a bit more work. 60, fantastic. Let's do more. 70, amazing. 80, you don't need to come and see me.
Yeah.
Right? What you're trying to say to people is that it's okay to be 30% out, because that's just life, right? But we are working together. And I think it's the same thing about accountability. You need to sort of be open and go like, look, I'm not trying to blame you. Or as you said, we need to work better and then get there.
So obviously from 2019 to 2021, 22, basically went from very few people to almost everybody on CGM, which, and I know you've spoken internationally on this, because other countries are like, how have you done that? Like, that's fairly unprecedented to kind of not just get the national reimbursement, but the actual implementation piece is two completely different things. I mean, you think about pump therapy back in 2008, it's a nice TA attached to it. You have to mandatory fund it. Yet we ended up with so low numbers because the implementation was just not there.
Yeah, I mean, we're at the ESD, and I've said this to everybody. Concern is that, look, it's wonderful to come to this ESD, and what are some of the big news? We've got newer GLP-1s, we've got mixed GLP-1s, oral GLP-1s, screening for type 1 diabetes. We've got a diabetes distress guideline. This is all fantastic. But if you take, for example, the diabetes distress guidelines, my question to the authors, and I met a couple of them and say, fantastic work, really good work. What happens now? What do I do with the person who have identified the diabetes distress? So what is it that the system needs to put in place? It's a bit like what's happened a little bit with eating disorders and type 1 diabetes. Yes, we've got services and we've got things to identify people. But what am I saying to the person? So that's important. For me, implementation is the absolute key to happen. So whether it's CGM, whether it's GLP-1 analogs, whatever it is, or even, when I was listening to your podcast about DVLA and driving, love that. Now, the question we are saying, okay, if we're identifying what tools are we now giving the person to help? So those are all important bits, I think.
And obviously people are going to be watching this and seeing what happened with CGM, and they've seen the nice technology appraisal for the hybrid closed loops and obviously the 5-year implementation. I think for a lot of people, obviously what happened, and quite understandably in social media, it's been released, everyone's going to go tomorrow. It's like, it's 5 years and we're doing it in the priority, which is the children and people first, because they're going to have it the longest. Then the people with the higher H1Cs and pregnancy. And then eventually the people with A1Cs of 7.5. And I think obviously that takes a little bit of time to get in. And I think it's hard to have patience when it's such a game-changing thing. But I think also for people who are listening to respect the fact that previous technology appraisals didn't come with money. This one came with money. So I want to know how that happened, because that for me is the bit of magic about that particular piece. Because with technology appraisals before, you go to the ICBs and they'd be like, we've already got 4 of these and we can't already fund them. So give me another, I'll just put it on the red list. So what made you really push for that, and how did that happen? Because that can't happen easy.
So for me, I've always said it's been a 10-year plan of my own in 2016, 17, when I sat down and I wanted to do what I wanted to do. So we always talked about making CGM. I've used the phrase before, tip of the spear. And I always used to say, because people say, Partha, why are we not doing bumps? And I say, but you got to convince the Chancellor and the Exchequer and everybody about return of investment. Because, I know in spite of the rhetoric, politicians are not bad people all around. They're trying and they want to use public taxpayers' money properly, etc. So what we did with CGM on Libra, in that we completely disrupted the market. But what we said at the time to the government is that, look, we're going to top slice money, so not use extra money. But hey, listen, if it works, would you give that money back? So actually people were not out of pocket. And they said, well, if you can do what you say, it will happen. And it did. Then when you go up and they're like, wow, this has worked. So what's next? And you go like, well, next is HCL. And they go like, how much would it cost? Now, if I go to them and say, well, if I give it to everybody, it's going to be $1 billion. They're going to go like, well, that's not going to happen.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, if you go like, look, I want to have a very nice structured approach. We'll do pilots, and they gave us a little bit of money. We'll do the pilots. We showed what it is. Then you're having a very good adult conversation with the politician or the Exchequer or NHS England Finance. Say, look, this is my trajectory. I want to do it over 5 years. And what I'm saying to you is that the return that you'll get over 5 years will make all your money back. And I personally think clinicians, and I say doctors, nurses, pharmacists, dietitians, everyone who are in leadership roles, we are not teaching them enough of the art of implementation. In your local system, how do you say to people, so if we did that more, then you're not sort of saying, oh, we need Partha Kar to come and deliver it, because that's a personality dependent and that's unsustainable.
No scalable.
Right? So you need distributed leadership. So you need to have the tools set to go like, okay, John, these are the 4 things you need to take to the table, and they can't deny you at that point. So that's what I would encourage people in this podcast listening. How do you get clinicians of any shape or form to have those things to take forward? Because there are other things coming in the world of type 1 diabetes.
Oh, yes, exactly.
There's immunotherapy coming, and it's all coming.
So
either the NHS goes like, oh, we don't do that sort of stuff, or you got to get ready for what's coming next. The NHS, argument's sake, if we suddenly find the Sana work, the Vertex are really exciting, we find, what is the NHS going to say? No, they can't.
No.
So how are you ready to do it? Important.
And I think something I've taken a personal playbook from some of the stuff that you've done, but also just on a local scale. And this can be for anything. I think it's applicable to most things, with the pilot you did for the HCL, which is whenever you go to somewhere, they go, oh, that randomized control trial you talk about in America, that's not going to apply to us. This over there, it's not going to apply to us. And it's the same as like, you'll go to a conference, I'll come back from ESC and say, I saw this really good thing. And then people are like, that won't apply to us. So you don't do that. You go in and you find a small pilot of people where you know it's got the best chance to win, i.e. people with higher H1Cs. You deliver, and then you have the conversation, oh, that won't work here. You're like, should say that, because we've now got 10 people who've been doing it and it works beautifully. And just go, okay, yeah, I've got no objections now. But if you don't go with that negotiation position, you've lost it. And that difference in randomized control trials, I remember reading the cost per poly was, you were in game. but all of a sudden you get a 1.5% drop in HbA1c. It's now under 20, and you bang, you're in. So you've got to create that. You've got to create that.
Well, that's what if you look at the hybrid closed loop, the randomized control trial didn't have the quality to go through. So that's why we did the real world data. And we talked to NICE, and we had a very good conversation. What do you want marker-wise? And one of the things we were very keen on doing is making sure the patient experience or quality of life change was taken into account. I don't think we do enough of it. Yeah. And I always say that if you improve people's quality of life, your HbA1c will improve. Yeah. It's honestly not that complicated.
Parents' day off work, all those things are never usually captured. I mean, it's huge. I mean, I just think now our clinic, we've now got 95% of people want hybrid closed loop, and the other 5% just don't want it for whatever reason, which is amazing. But our clinic, it's just changed. Yeah. It's just totally changed. We're actually having a conversation with someone as opposed to going, where's the numbers and where's the insulin dose? Can you see this chart here? It's like, everything looks like it's going good. Just update the manual basal rate and like, tell me what's going on with your life. What's happening?
It's a proper conversation. Just
a bit of a laugh, and you get to know people again, which is so refreshing, and also allows you to start building in like the transition and the alcohol conversations, the drugs conversations, the key things that these kids are going to encounter that you couldn't do before. You can now start to have those conversations, which I think is just changing the way we're doing things. And for us, our next step is now we're no longer chasing people every 3 months. We now need to get the software on Gluco or wherever, where you just stratify people by time below range, time in range, and you're proactively contacting it. That then becomes HbA1c. We've gone from 60 to 56. We'll be getting down to 53 by doing that model, and it's just building from there. So, I mean, just a massive appreciation for our end, and that I think I want to, for people, for healthcare professionals, I say this every time I talk, I'm like, if you've learned something today, don't go back and tell your team. Go back and do it. Go back and do it on a small number of people, and then take it to your team. Because if you take it back, just the knowledge, like they do that in Birmingham, they do it in Portsmouth, can't do that here. Can't do that here. You can do. It's you just got to get stuff
get on with it.
So that kind of gives us an idea of CGM, what's happened, HCL. So that, I wouldn't say that work's done, but it's in there. So what's kind of next to you? I know you're kind of involved with equality, diversity. What's happening in that sphere for you now, and how are you taking your lessons that you've taken from here and trying to make sure? I'll briefly include on my story from here, because this is really interesting. It might interest you. Is I presented in IFPAD in 2021-22 about our CGM Academy. I was really proud. I presented it. I was giving a big one on the dance floor, and Dr. Adler from Stanford came and she's like, "Oh, you're right." And I was with Desi, and she's like, "Oh, this is Dr. Adler." I was like, "All right, we've been presenting." "Oh, yeah, today on the CGM Academy." I was like, "How good we were." She's like, "All right, and delivered it equitably?" It's like, yeah, of course. I was like, "Are you sure? Tell me about your demographic." I was like, "Well, we're 40-50% Caucasian, and the rest of a different split in Birmingham." So do you think your CGM out of 100 people, you've got an out of 300, it's split 40 white and 60 the rest? I was like, yeah. And I went back and I was like, oh no, we're 80 white and 20 there. And it was such a lesson to go, the level of unconscious bias that you're not aware of can only be made aware if you look at the data. And it was a painful lesson, but it was such an important lesson, because it made us then go positive to get it right over the next 100. And we'd split it, but we only knew if we asked the difficult, horrible question. I remember presenting to our team going, "I've just been to ISPAD and I want to say it was a really positive experience." And it was, but I'll come back and I'm like, we've got so much work to do. So much work to do.
But, let's see where we have got to, right? The pediatric community. And so I've been doing a lot of work in this health inequality space. And I must say, it's probably one of my proudest things that now in children, there are no gaps. That's phenomenal work from pediatric teams. I always say the example, and I'll give the best example I can give, is when I first showed the data about gaps, it was nearly half black and white child. I remember a pediatrician saying to me, "Well, this feels a little bit disappointing because it feels like you're calling us racists." And what I said to her, it still holds. And I said, "No, I'm not. I'm showing you the data. If you, however, look at this data and say it's okay, then you have a bias. On the other hand, I want you to try, and I have no issues if you fail. Because in fact, I would like you to sometimes fail so I can tell everybody else not to try that intervention. But I want you to try. That's all I want you to do." And I think if you see what pediatric community has achieved in the UK now, it's nowhere in the planet has anybody done that. So it's doable. It's the same NHS. And I think I do the other work, which is about looking at racial inequalities or racial issues within the medical workforce, we all have bias. And I think even I have biases. I think what we need to do is educate ourselves of the bias and go like, what do I need to do better, right? Have I said something which could be crass? Have I said something which was supposed to be a joke? It's not a joke. And all those sort of things come into play. So I think it's been a wonderful experience for learning for me and challenging my own biases on the way as you go along. So, but I think there's a shining example from the pediatric community of what the NHS can do, because you just keep on hearing stories, oh my God, there's health inequalities. It does and can't get better. Yes, of course it can. Look at what has been done with kids. So
I think a big part of that's the NPDA is just when you see those graphs and you look at them and you just go,
oh,
it just looks horrible, but that's what you need. You need that jolt of, okay, this is how it is. Take a bit of objective self-reflection, take all the personal stuff out of it. We've all got subconscious biases. Unless you're allowed to get to that space in your own head, you're never going to make the next step. You're just going to bury your head in the sand, which is obviously then leads to it progressing. So that's really interesting.
But I think it goes back to the point you made about the public data.
Yeah, it's massive.
You've got to see data as educative tools, not as a personal affront, if that makes sense.
And obviously now you're moving to the get it right first time, which is, I guess the next step is now we've got these technologies and we're getting in there. Let's get them in at the beginning. Let's make sure we're educating properly. Peter Adelson, obviously from Sweden, they obviously have a big peer learning and peer support. Did you take anything from that type of model? How did all that come about, and how has that worked?
I'll tell you a story about Peter Adelson, because Peter and me, we have had this running debate for a long time. And I will always credit Peter for one thing, which is Peter said to me when we were setting off on this journey that the important thing is that you need to beat me. Right? And I said, right. And he said, we come from we are Swedish. So let me tell you something Roger Federer once said. And I still remember, and I always, and in fact, I met him today at this conference and it was lovely chatting with him. And he said, Roger Federer once said, I would not be half the player I was if I didn't have Nadal. And he said, I want you to push us. I want you to beat us. And then I will say, you will never beat me. But in the process of doing that, people with type 1 diabetes have benefited. And I love that analogy. So we always, whenever we meet, we have a running joke. Well, where are you now? Well, what's your percentage? And it's wonderful to see that. And Peter is a really inspirational figure. So there's a lot of work that I learned from Peter. I think some of it, the NHS, I think the way he looks after people, sometimes the NHS will struggle to do that, if that makes sense. I think some of the British personalities were not matched with the Swedish personalities, how they would. But the concept, I think, is wonderful. I mean, that's, as gold standard care as you want to get. And we should all aspire to. So whenever people say to me, are you the best? And I'm like, well, I don't know. Have we beaten Sweden?
That's interesting, as Peter was sat in that chair on Tuesday night and he talked very much about his sports background and how that was a massive, when he started in his clinic, he was like, where's the sports mentality here? We're on a competition. And it was very similar to Birmingham when I started there. We were kind of halfway in the league tables, like, this is not okay. No, and now we're in the top three, and we're not looking at the UK anymore. We're looking at chasing Sweden. Like we're in this. We're not looking in the UK days. We're looking at the sweep registry. We're now halfway there. We're going to get into the top.
We want to get. So me and Peter always got along because I always talk about sporting analogies like Jurgen Klopp and saying that it's not about the trophies he's won. It's the mentality he's created and the hope he's created around everybody around Liverpool to go like, I think we can win now trophies, right?
Belief.
And that's very important for a leader to leave that belief in the community that, hey, listen, if stem cell comes, the NHS can deliver, rather than, well, I'm in the NHS, I don't think I'll ever get it. So that's the concept I love.
The journey has been obviously from a diabetes perspective, and I kind of alluded to it a little bit. I think one thing that I would say, and I sent you a book because I think it just reminds me of you, which is a book called, my favorite book called Skin in the Game, which basically means if there's something you believe in it, are you willing to put yourself on the line for it? And obviously you've done that with the diabetes sphere, but you've now got a bigger challenge with obviously the physician associates, assistants. So I understand a little bit about the situation. So my take from my minimal understanding, I first came across it in the ATTD with the diabetes nurse. I'm like, have you heard this PA stuff? And I'm like, well, I don't know this PA stuff. Like, Partha's going mad. I don't understand. It's like, well, these roles have been brought in. This is my understanding, which could be way off. And in theory, they were meant to be supporting the clinician doing tasks that they were nominated to do to support them, so the doctor could then go and do the stuff they were trained to do. But what might have happened is that too much autonomy was given or taken, I don't know, and then some of these procedures that shouldn't have been included within that remit were being done independently, which obviously flags a huge operating outside of bound. And I just start from the beginning. So the whole situation with obviously the physicians, assistants, associates, as I understand it, was these roles are brought in to support clinicians and do I'm not going to say menial tasks, but the tasks that the doctors should not be prioritizing that time for. They should be prioritizing their time for what they got trained for, not doing things like maybe taking the bloods and ordering different pieces, making sure the care's coordinated, but leaving the work that the doctor has been trained for to do. But maybe what's happened is a bit of slippage, a bit of doctors missing here or there, and then this role sort of slipped, and then there's maybe people performing procedures, etc., that they're not qualified to do, and also should be doing under supervision and shouldn't be doing independently. And then obviously there was some high profile situations, and then that got took to obviously a discussion meeting, and then everything kicked off from there. Am I directionally correct?
Directionally, yeah. I mean, I think for those who listen, I mean, this is where social media is such a bad thing, because I think it interprets, so I've said this publicly as well, taking away the physician associate assistant, and I'll come back to them in a minute, is who should do X and Y job when it comes to looking after somebody with an illness, right? And my view is very simple. I've got a very simplistic view, which is, do I feel my loved one should be looked after that person? And the answer to the question is, if the answer to the question, yes, I feel they've done all the training. So for example, would I want, if my loved one had type 1 diabetes, a specialist nurse to look after their diabetes? Well, of course I would, right? Because they're trained, they know what they're doing. Would I want them to go to a dietitian to talk about the dosing? Hey, listen, you're eating too much carbs or too much protein, the glucose is released differently. Would I want them to go to a dietitian to do that? Would I like them to go to a podiatrist? Well, obviously the trained person. When it comes to physician associates or assistants, whatever you want to call them, whatever the National Review says, my view is very simple, is that I have no issues with anybody looking after anybody with diabetes as long as they're trained. So for me, patient safety is really, really important. So the debate that has got wrapped around and stuff is like, is it about doctor replacement, which could be a political move, etc.? That's fine. And that's beyond our pay grade, so to speak. Or is this about saying, well, the training doesn't matter, anybody can have a go? And if it's the latter, then you have a problem, or I have a problem, because I wouldn't want my loved one to be seen by somebody who's not trained. And my philosophy then becomes, if I don't want my loved one so if I, with my privilege, I can go to a GP surgery or a hospital and say, I don't want to be seen by that grade because I'm not sure about their training. Well, most of the population do not have that privilege to say that. So I would say that I have to use my privilege to go like, well, I would like the population to have the same right of choice. So right training, right supervision, that's what I've always said, right scope of work. And I think that's been the debate for me. Make sure they're supervised, make sure they're regulated, make sure they're working to their training scope, which ironically is what we say to everybody else. Then it's fine. I have zero issues. So that's where I think the debates happen. And then it obviously went into a national review and all sorts of stuff. So I've been obviously had my skin in the game on that one, big 100%. Time, because I've said, look, I'll put my reputation on the line on this because I strongly believe in this. And that's been the sort of journey with that. So it's one of those things.
And I think it's interesting because I'm thinking for myself personally, I'm very, very interested in CGM accuracy in the current situation where there's not standardization. And for me, that's my skin in the game. I'm happy to email people, put myself like a right plonker, because ultimately that is irrelevant to me, because I know that there are people in clinics at the moment who are going in with 70% time in range on different systems. One of them's got a HbA1c is 0.5% to 1% higher, not because the CGMs are inaccurate, because they're aiming at different places. One is at venous glucose and one is at capillary. So for me, moving forward, as we're kind of like, CGM's extremely important. We're going to use it for clinical endpoints, and we're kind of using them for stage 2 into stage 3. You can't do that unless you've got it standardized. And I just think for me, that's my skin in the game. And from seeing what you're doing within the physician associate situation is kind of like, I don't really care whether I look like a dickhead, if I'm totally honest, because if it means that this issue gets raised to a level where the manufacturers probably would prefer it to be to capillary, but it's not in their interest unless people with diabetes, patients associations get on it, and they're only going to do it if they know and if people are jumping up and down. So I would like to say thank you for like showing that so other people can follow.
So it's interesting you raised the continuous glucose. I was having a conversation today about this, and I had some companies go like, we got this new sensor. And I said to them, without going into all the efficacy, I said to them, look, do you know what? There's three things there. And because the company came to me, no names, and said, we got this sensor and it's really cheap. And I said, okay, I've always got three fundamental questions when you bring me new technology, right? Or AI or whatever. Mm-hmm. I said, okay, number one, does it do what it says on the tin? If you're telling me, so are the numbers accurate? Are they okay? Yeah. Two, tell me a little bit about your false positives and false negatives and the impacts or how you mitigate the impact, which is very important to somebody with type 1 or type 2 diabetes. Then comes the price, because once you cross the first two, I can talk about the price. Otherwise, if you believe you're going to give me something for cheap, well, you might as well give me a placebo then. At least it's safe.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right? Your product may not be safe. And I think this is what I keep on saying to manufacturers. This is why we need that standard. You're absolutely right to have that skin in the game, because what you're doing is you're saying, I want people to be safe from what they're doing. I want their diabetes control to be correct.
And it's ultimately, like I've always said along the way, no CGM is risk-free, but the companies that have done their designs properly, you understand what that risk is. And on the Clark-Herod grid, which is zone C, is where you start making the wrong decisions. The market leaders, they're down at 0.3% of readings, which is a more than acceptable risk. But then you have someone come to market with very poor data. It's not that it's a poor product, it's just you can't understand the risk. So why, as a clinician or a person with diabetes, would you take that risk when there's other products where you know the risk? And I think it's just, it's just interesting. But from a skin in the game perspective, it's certainly, I'm happy to just do whatever, but seeing other examples is really helpful. And I'm sure there's probably people watching this who are within their particular healthcare trust or even their department team, and they really believe in something, but they're kind of like on the edge of, am I really going to put my neck out here and do it? My message would be, if you believe in it, you've got to do it.
Absolutely. So thank you for the book. I've read it when I was in Italy and I went on holiday. So what I fundamentally believe in, the skin in the game concept is really important because you are putting your head above the parapet, right? So when we talk about the PA thing, people have said to me, and there is actually a tweet of mine from about a year ago when I said, pretty much predict what's going to happen next. I'm going to get this, that, everything. And that's exactly how it's panned. I knew what I was walking myself into. But I think the important message that I left is that, look, I wasn't wrong. There's a national review which has agreed with what I said about their need to be trained and need to be having scope. So fine, I take the consequences as I go. But if you're absolutely right. This is what I said. Whatever sphere you're in, if it's diabetes, whatever you want to do, you've got to put your skin in the game and have your neck out and go like, you know what? I'm staking my reputation on this because I so firmly believe in this. I am very happy to put my hand up and say I was wrong publicly if companies come to you and go like, hey, listen, all our sensors are perfect. All right. Sorry about that.
Exactly. I mean, when I remember doing the review, I contacted them and said, listen, you say you've got data on fat, and you may, and I'm going to look like a right plonker because I'm going out there saying I don't think you have. Because if you did, you would have shown it to me. But if you bring it to me, I'll get up there and I'll do a talk for you. I'll get up there and tell you how good your data is set, and I'll sell it for you.
And
I don't believe you got it.
I'd even say, so it's ironic you say that because I did a podcast with PA colleagues, and I said, look, if the review and everything says I'm wrong, I will be the first one to come out. You know what? Got that wrong, right? And that's the important bit. That's the skin in the game concept where you're also happy to take the knock and say,
take the downside.
Yeah, okay, I got it wrong. So I think that's important. And to be honest, it is a fundamental principle as to how things get delivered because people see that. Is that like, okay, he's staked his line on that one. So fair enough. So it's important, very important.
So I respect for your time, but I want to try and summarize Partha's playbook from what I've heard today. So the first thing is you need to communicate with people, not in a way that is sterile and boring, but in a way you're listening. You're actually listening. You got that from your mentors. You kind of saw them just listen and take in. So that's number one. And then number two is if you see something where you believe in it, You need to make sure that you can prove that it's working in your local area before you take it bigger and you go and ask the big question. You've got to have some local insights and data to take, not just data from somewhere else. Even if it's small, you've got to have something there.
Mm.
If you do manage a change, you create accountability, and you create accountability in a non-negative valence way, just in an objective way, so people can use a tool such as a RAG rating, not as good, bad, or whatever, but stop, think about it, go, and make sure that language is neutral. And then finally, if you believe in something, get your skin in the game and get it moving, and be prepared, if it goes tits up, to hold your hands up.
I think leadership is I always talk about leadership. We make the mistake of associating leadership with charisma. It's not, because that's a very common and very sexy thing to fall for. It's not. Leadership, to me, should always be about outcomes, right? And that I always keep saying. We will know charismatic leaders who you go like, good Lord, they've set everything backwards. And you'll have people who just did the job and look at their achievements. So I think if we are going into leadership roles and doing or anything, you need to think, well, what's the Northern Star I'm aiming for? What am I trying to do when I go to clinic? And finally, also, it's about when you go to bed at night, or 10 years in the future when you're sitting down, and did I do okay? And if the answer is, yeah, I think I did all right, most of my people are happy at that, then you've done a good job. And I think that sort of thing of keeping it very clear and forward, that's what I tend to do all the time, which is, how would my parents feel what I've done? How would my people who are living with type 1 diabetes? And for me, a lovely barometer, which recently happened, is that, so I tweeted something about the Union Jack, etc. Nothing controversial. I said, look, during the Olympics, we all had Union Jacks, and it was so lovely to see. That's all I said. And there was a torrent of views on social media. A lot of people asking me to go home, and I kept on asking why they were asking me to go back to Dudley. So,
From Dudley.
Yeah. But I put that up deliberately for people to understand the world that sometimes we inhabit. But I always ask people then to look at the comments from the people living with diabetes below that, which is full of warmth and love and Partha, you belong here and you've done for this. And this is what I think is what Britain is about, right? And that's what things is about. That public face will get it. I genuinely believe in the goodness of people, because if I look back at success, it doesn't happen without a truckload of good people making it happen, right? Doing the right thing. So I think that's how leadership should be looked at. But I think the charisma factor sometimes kicks in, and people get swayed by that. Don't. I think you need to be more thinking about, what's my Northern Star, and did I do the right thing? And, if you have a good relationship with your parents, were they proud of me? Did you think then I think you're doing all right. That's the way to look at it.
It also sounds like taking an element of risk with things that you believe in, and some ways makes it exciting as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, thank you for your time. And I will certainly put Partha's Playbook 5 principles, so people, if they've listened and enjoyed that, I'll put a little lead piece together so that maybe they can just think about, is there something I really believe in? And if there is, how do I get there? And I think you've laid out a nice little framework for people to follow on as small a scale as they want to as big a scale as they want to. You can do it from there.
Thank you very much, John.